Daniel, the 5th chapter tonight. Daniel, the 5th chapter. This is the story of the fall of Babylon. And Belshazzar is the king that is mentioned here. He's actually the second in command under his father Nabonidus, and his father's out doing military campaigns, and this is 23 years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. So the kingdom continued for 23 years after Nebuchadnezzar died. And the year of this chapter is BC 538. 538. So they've been through some rulers since him. His son, evil Merodach, came in and he ruled for 4 years, and he was murdered by conspirators. The head conspirator was his son-in-law, Nebuchadnezzar, and married to Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, and he ruled for 4 years, and then he was killed in battle, and a fellow that came along and married his widow. No, there was a short time that one of his sons, that was kind of a crazy kid, ruled for a few months, and then they beat him to death, okay? And in the meantime, Nabonidus had married the widow of the former king, and so he became king, and he was the last ruler of Babylon, okay? Now, he was the last ruler, but when we read this chapter, which was the last chapter in the life of Babylon, it says that Belshazzar was the king. Well, Belshazzar was a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, who was the second ruler. When Nabonidus went out, he put Belshazzar in charge. So that's why when Belshazzar sees the handwriting on the wall and says, whoever can interpret this for me, I'm gonna give them riches and a gold chain around their neck, and they'll become the third ruler in the kingdom. He couldn't give them the second ruler because he was the second ruler, and whoever interpreted would become the third ruler, okay? So that's the background of the chapter, because in 23 years, they've been through 4 different monarchs, and it has come to the end of the Babylonian time. God said from the beginning that he would use Nebuchadnezzar as his tool, his instrument, to judge the Jews because of their disobedience and their rebellion and their idolatry against him. And then he said, and after they've accomplished my purposes, I will judge them too. And then we saw in the second chapter, when, that's ringing a little bit, when Nebuchadnezzar had his dream, and the statue, he was the golden head, and then afterwards were the arms and chest of silver and so forth. This was the time when the head came off and it became the silver kingdom. It would be changing from the lion to the bear if you're looking into the 7th chapter of Daniel, which we haven't got there yet, but so this is the changeover, and so we're going to be studying about this tonight. Now, for some reason, our author wanted us to know, and so I'll just share it with you. Okay, there was a fella back when Noah's Ark landed, and the three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the bad guy, and his son was Nimrod, and Nimrod was the one who started Babylon, okay? And then Shem, a second son, or no, he was the oldest son. Shem, the oldest son, had a son named Asher, okay? And Asher established the city of Nineveh. Nineveh was the Assyrians, okay? Babylon was those from the son Ham, who was also a cursed son, all right? So Assyria took over Chaldea, whose capital was Babylon, in 1270 BC. 1270 BC. If you're not interested in this, then it's okay with me, all right? Later on, in the time of Tiglath-Pileser, you've read about him in the Bible. He is from Assyria, okay? During his time, there was a fellow by the name of Saul-Zuris the Mede, and he conquered Babylon, okay, with the help of a fellow by the name of Nabonassar, who was the governor of Babylon under the Assyrians. So he helped the Medes overcome overthrew the Assyrians in 625. Nebuchadnezzar became the king of his new kingdom, the Babylonian Empire. He reigned from 625 to 605, and then his son Nebuchadnezzar, who we have to deal with in the book of Daniel, became the king in 605. That's just an aside, okay? Now, Babylon was a big city, okay? It was a 15-mile square. Now, I've kind of told you about this before, but it had walls all the way around that were 87 foot thick. They were 350 foot tall. There were 250 towers around the walls. The Euphrates River ran through the middle of the city diagonally, and from north to south, and they had a big moat, a ditch dug outside the city that the river kept filled up with water, and the city only had 2 gates, and they were double gates, and they were giant gates made out of brass. To cross the moat, they had drawbridges. So if they drew up the drawbridge, there was a moat, a 350-foot wall, and guys throwing stuff on you from up above, okay? So it was basically impenetrable, but we have a prophecy from God that says there's a fellow by the name of Cyrus who is going to take the city and make a decree to send his people back to Jerusalem. And Jeremiah had already set the time limit of the captivity to 70 years. Now we're coming up on that. In fact, we're 2 years before the end of the captivity. It's the year 538, and guess who's outside the city? The Medes and the Persians. And they're encamped against the city, and they want to take the city. So what does Belshazzar do? He's the young whippersnapper second king that's in charge, and he says, well, we are so we're so safe inside of this city, I am going to defy the armies of the Medes and the Persians by holding the biggest banquet ever held. And it was. It's the biggest banquet we have in history, especially in biblical history, which is the best history, okay? He's going to get 1,000 of his lords. He's going to have his wife, his concubines, his princes, and they're all going to have a big hoopla, hold a big party, and they're going to drink it up, and they're going to worship false gods. And our author said in these times it was full of perversion along with everything else, okay? So the table is set. Belshazzar is holding a party in defiance of the armies of the Medes and the Persians that are outside of the city. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, his concubines drank in them. It didn't say the 1,000 lords drank in them. There weren't that many, but there were those guys, the head guys that were sitting at the head table, so to speak. They were drinking out of the utensils that came out of the temple at Jerusalem, all right? They drank wine, and they praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass and of iron. Now look at this. Does that remind you of something? Gold, silver, brass, and iron. That was the statue that came up to Nebuchadnezzar well, it also gives gods of wood and stone, but I thought it was an interesting combination there. Okay, so we've got all these guys there, and they're having a big party. They're probably already drunk when they go to get so what can we do to make this really, really special? Well, hey, let's get those gold and silver vessels that came out of the temple in Jerusalem. They're the fanciest ones we have. Let's use those to drink wine out of. And while we're doing it, we're going to praise false gods. And I want to tell you something. That was the last straw. God said, oh, no, you don't. All right? So in verse 5, it says, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hands and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. And the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. And the king spake and said unto the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read the writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed in scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So, are you getting the picture? Biggest party we have in record. The next party that we have even close to it happened later with King Ahasuerus, and when he was holding a banquet in the first chapter of Esther, and he called in the princes from 120 provinces of his kingdom. And that was a big deal, but it didn't even come close to the 1,000 lords that he added at this one, okay? Now, while they drank, it told us what they were doing. And they were worshiping, and they were just having a great old time. Out of the sleeve of the night, I can't do it very well, came a part of a hand, and it was God's hand, and God began to write on the wall. He wrote 3 letters over here, according to the Talmud. The 3 letters M-N-A, M-N-A, T-K-L, and then P-R-S. All right? Now the interpretation, well, we'll get to that in a minute. So this hand was writing on the wall. And I want you to know something. If it had thundered and lightened in that palace, it wouldn't have caused more commotion than the handwriting on the wall.
No kidding.
Because the candlestick was there, it was a lit up area. Here comes this partial part of a hand and starts writing on the wall. And you know, they might have taken it as a hallucination, except that when they blinked their eyes and looked again, it was still there. So here's this writing on the wall. It'd be like if you guys, we were all here, and all of a sudden a hand came out and started writing on that wall over there. Now that'd be pretty fantastic. Okay? I would hope it would say something nice about us. But, so it shook him up so much, the Bible says his knees were shaking, knocking together, and he was just discombobulated. He called for the wise men again. All right, so when he gets them in there, he tells them what the reward's going to be. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. So this guy is shaking in his boots. He calls emergency meeting, come together, all the wise men. Tell me what it says. We don't have a clue. And his face fell, and all of his guests were just astonished at what had happened and at the change in the king. Okay? The stage is set. It says, verse 10, are you ready? Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. And the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, he was actually his grandfather, but by the way, in the Semitic language, there was no word for grandfather or grandson. So like other places in the Bible, it was father, even though it might be a grandfather or a great-grandfather, all right? I'm just throwing that in there. Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master, he made this one master of magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers, for as much as an excellent spirit, and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hard sentences, dissolving of doubts, were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Now this lady, the queen, she wasn't Belshazzar's wife, because Belshazzar's wife was with him in the banquet. She wasn't Nebuchadnezzar's wife, because she would have, if she was still alive, she would have been so old and decrepit, she wouldn't have cared what was going on. Okay? This was probably the actual king's wife, Nebuchadnezzar, who was out on campaigns, and but she had been there in the time of her father's reign, okay? And she even, she's the king's daughter who first married Nebuchadnezzar, whatever his name is, and then he died in battle, and she married Nebuchadnezzar, who then made himself king. And so she shows up in the banquet hall, and she says, don't be so scared. There's somebody who can interpret this. So the queen remembered Daniel from the days when her father was the king, and she recommended him. She called him, she said his name is Daniel, but your grandfather named him Belteshazzar. Now, I had a conversation this morning. Belshazzar and Belteshazzar are not the same name, but they both have to do with the same god of Baal, okay, in the kingdom. All right? Now, well, it's T-E, the difference, okay? Now this god Baal, if you didn't know this, there were like 8, let me see if I got it, 8 towers, 75 feet tall each, with a winding staircase going on the outside of them, and at the top was built the Temple of Baal, okay? It was the most extravagant thing in the whole world. There was an image of Baal that was 45 foot tall and made of solid gold. It was estimated at $17,500,000, and the utensils in Baal's temple were estimated at $200 million. It was truly, Babylon was the most extravagant city in the world at that time, and probably still would be if it was still in existence, okay? So that name Baal rings a bell. So here comes the Queen Mother, and she says, call for Daniel. Then in verse 13, then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah? First thing he wants to know, if he's a Jew. That's an interesting part of this situation. He said, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry. I have even heard of thee. Well, I don't know if he had heard of him before the king's wife came in, but he said, I've even heard of ye, and he repeated her words exactly. I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in thee, that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me that they should read this writing, and the writing's on the wall. And Daniel's standing there, and he may be looking at the king, and he may be looking at the writing, and he already knows what it says. He already knows that the kingdom is over. He already knows that this is the call to judgment. But the king's talking. The king says that they should make known to me this writing and make known to me the interpretation of, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee, where'd he hear it? From the queen, that thou canst make interpretation and dissolve doubts. Dissolve doubts. I want to tell you something. You know who dissolves doubts? God dissolves doubts. Amen. Now, if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, Daniel already knew that the kingdom was over. He already read the message. He already read the telegram. He already knew what was going to happen. He knew that the promises were empty because the guy didn't have the authority to make those promises. So what did he say? Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known unto him the interpretation. O thou king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he slew. Whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he set up. Whom he would, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him, and he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts. His dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. Now, it had been 23 years, well, actually more than that, because if you take, Nebuchadnezzar lived a year after he recovered from being a beast, and it was 7 years before that when Daniel pronounced the judgment. No, it was 8 years before that when Daniel had pronounced the judgment on him. So, and it was 23 years since the death of the king. So we're going back about 31, 32 years in the memory of Daniel. And have you noticed that he's recalling it just like it happened yesterday? Because this was not a small incident in the life of Daniel. And so he takes a moment to recount to him what happened to his grandfather, that God gave him the kingdom, and he was lifted up in pride, and God humbled him until he found out that God was the only one that ruled in the affairs of men. Amen. Now, he comes back in verse 22. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest this all. You knew this. You were aware of this. And yet you haven't humbled yourself, but you have lifted yourself up. You have lifted yourself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, thy concubines have drunk wine in them, And thou hast praised the gods of silver, of gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. I mean, Daniel is at least 88 years old at this time. I don't know that he's tottering or anything like that, because he sounds pretty strong to me. But and he's not done yet, because he's gonna go into the reign of Cyrus and Darius there, and God's going to continue to give him revelations, and we're going to see those in the last part of this book. But Daniel is telling Belshazzar how the cow ate the cabbage. Okay? He's telling it to him straight. He said, you know, your father, your grandfather, he was blessed of God, and he didn't recognize God, and God humbled him. And you knew about that, and you didn't recognize God, and you used his utensils for the wrong thing, and you were worshiping gold and silver and brass and iron and wood and stone, and not God. Then was the part of the hand sent from him. That means from God. This part of the hand that you saw, that was sent from God. God doesn't have hands, so if it was a representation of a hand, it was still the representation of God's hand, because the handwriting was on. Have you ever heard the saying, the handwriting was on the wall? The handwriting was on the wall, okay? And this is the writing that is written. Mene, tekel, upharsin. And this is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Punto. Okay? Tekel. You, O king, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Not your kingdom, not your feasting. You are weighed in the balances and you are found wanting. Peres. Now you say, well, it said upharsin up there. Where do you get Peres? Well, Peres is the singular form of the word upharsin. Okay? And by the way, the letters, if they were written on the wall, the last set of letters, there would have been the MNA, TKL, PRS, which, by the way, is the way you abbreviate Persians in that time. So that's probably where he got the Medes and the Persians. I think God just told him what it meant. But he said, Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Now, then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Okay, we're going to stop right there. Okay, what's going on outside while the banquet's going on inside? We don't have a lot of time, but let me tell you how it happened. Okay, here's Cyrus, and he's outside. And he's got his army divided into three groups. And one group, they have already, out of the sight of the king of the 350-foot walls, they have built diverting channels for the river Euphrates. And so at the given signal, the one group of the soldiers is going to stop up the river. I don't know if they had places set where they could just cave it in or roll boulders. I don't know how they did it, but they did it. And they, well, I think God did it too, but they diverted the Euphrates River. No small task, okay? And then the river, the water going down, didn't keep going down. And he had one third of his soldiers were at the north gate, at the river. There were a third at the southern gate in the riverbank. When the water got down low enough that they could just trench in there, they came in and they met in the middle. Now, they still would not have taken the city because in the banks of the river that were too high to climb, there were brass gates. If the brass gates had been closed and locked, the defenders of the city could have easily continued to defend the city. Those guys, if they got there and the gates were closed in the river gates that led into the city, they would have had to just turn around and go back. But guess what? 175 years before, God had said, Cyrus is going to take the city. And this is how it's going to happen. And it did happen. And by the way, that was 100 years before Cyrus was ever born. And that's the truth. And so while these guys were in there and the handwriting was on the wall and they were worried about the handwriting on the wall, they'd already stopped up the river. The soldiers were already poised. The water slowed down enough, it had gotten low enough that the soldiers went in, they met, the gates were unlocked, they went in, they took the city easily. They took it so quick and so suddenly that there were people in Babylon that didn't know for 3 days that the city had been taken. They didn't destroy the city. They just took it. They killed the king. And they took the city. And they took power of it. Ooh, the next verse says, you know, sometimes God just says, hey, how do you like me now? So, in the very next verse, it says, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. And Darius, the Median, took the kingdom, even about 80, being about 82 years old. Now, Darius didn't take the city, and that's not just according to the Bible, that's according to historians. Cyrus took the city. But Cyrus was the nephew, and Darius was the uncle. Okay? The Medes and the Persians were related. Okay? And so nephew Cyrus went on to fight other battles as king, and he set Darius over the affairs of Babylon. All right? And Darius was 62 years old when this took place. And if Cyrus was his nephew, he could be close to his age. I mean, I was older than some of my aunts, okay, or one of my aunts, and my uncles were 7 and 8 years older than me because I was the oldest son of the oldest son of the oldest daughter, all that kind of stuff, okay? But we don't know how much is in between them, but of course, Cyrus is younger, and he puts his uncle on the throne to be the king of Babylon. It was Cyrus that 2 years later made the decree to send the Jews back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls and lay the foundation for the temple. Now, that's the 5th chapter of Daniel. There's a whole lot more to it. and I've run out of time. The Bible tells us in Jeremiah and in Isaiah that Babylon, the city, will be great and wonderful, and that it will be absolutely destroyed. And according to the description, it will be destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah. It will be destroyed suddenly. That hasn't happened yet. It wasn't destroyed when the Medes and the Persians took it over. It went down some, but it wasn't destroyed, okay? When Alexander the Great got to Babylon and was going to take the city, he was fast moving. And sometimes he sent a group over there to conquer that one, and a group over there. He took all of his army to Babylon. And the people of Babylon opened the gates and welcomed Alexander the Great willingly. Alexander had drawn up plans to rebuild Babylon as the capital of his empire. But death interrupted the plans. He died at 33. And the plans for, according to what I read, the plans for the rebuilding of Babylon are still in the French magistrate, whatever it is, okay? This is going to happen. Babylon has never existed as Babylon since those times. It has become different. It has been named different cities. There have been people there. At one time, the whole kit caboodle were Jews, because they'd taken the Jews there as captives, and the Jews multiplied, just like they did in Egypt. And so at one time it was called the City of the Two Mosques. At one time it was called Hillman. It's going to be rebuilt probably in the time of the tribulation or shortly there before. But then it's going to be destroyed in one day. And according to the scripture, it's going to be cataclysmic. It's going to be destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah. And by the way, Babylon is built over great deposits of tar. When they built their hanging gardens, one of the thick layers that they put on the gardens was tar, because they had plenty available. But there's going to be a cataclysmic earthquake. There's going to be a lightning storm from heaven. It's going to set the place on fire. Then there's going to be an earthquake. It's going to be the greatest center of commerce under the Antichrist that the world has ever seen. And it's going to sink, the Bible says, like a millstone into the earth. It's going to catch on fire, and it's going to go down into the tar pits of the earth in a great earthquake. And it's going to disappear from sight. That hasn't happened yet, folks. But it's on the horizon. It's coming. All right? You say, all that sounds fantastic. Well, I didn't read it in the New York Times. That would be fantastic. I read it. It's still there. It's still there, but it's a minor city, about 10,000 in population. All right? But it has always been viewed by those who are doing world commerce as a perfect location, a strategic location for all the commerce of the world. Okay? So, at any rate, I told you I'd just give you a taste of it because I didn't have time to do it all. We're gonna be dismissed because we're